The streets of Chicago were not kind to Marcus Johnson, but they had become his home. At just 16 years old, he carried the weight of a life that most adults would struggle to endure. His story began with abandonment. A mother who left when he was 10 and a father who disappeared into the haze of addiction long before that. With no family to turn to, Marcus found himself navigating a world that seemed determined to break him. Yet despite everything, he refused to let bitterness take root in his heart. Every morning, Marcus woke up wherever he had managed to find shelter the night before. Sometimes it was under the flickering lights of an abandoned subway station. Other times it was tucked away in the corner of a quiet alley behind stacked cardboard boxes. He had learned early on how to blend into the background, avoiding trouble with both strangers and those who prowled the streets looking for someone weaker to exploit. Survival wasn't easy, but Marcus had developed a system. He scavenged food from dumpsters behind restaurants after closing time, carefully choosing items that weren't too spoiled. On particularly lucky days, he might stumble upon half-eaten sandwiches or slightly bruised fruits tossed aside by customers who didn't know what hunger truly felt like. Despite the harshness of his existence, Marcus held on to dreams that seemed almost laughable given his circumstances. In quieter moments, he imagined himself living in a cozy apartment with warm meals waiting for him every evening. He dreamed of going to school, making friends, and maybe even becoming something important. Someday. Someone people respected. But these thoughts usually faded quickly, replaced by the reality of his situation. The streets had taught him that hope could be dangerous if you let it linger too long. Still, deep down, there was a part of him that believed things could change. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. On this particular November afternoon, the air was crisp, carrying the first hints of winter. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, dusting the city sidewalks with a thin layer of white powder. Marcus pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around himself as he wandered aimlessly through the bustling streets. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that it had been nearly 2 days since his last proper meal. He tried to ignore the feeling, focusing instead on the rhythmic crunch of snow beneath his worn sneakers. As he passed Millennium Park, the sound of laughter caught his attention. Children darted around the frozen fountain, their cheeks rosy from the cold. Parents stood nearby, bundled in thick coats, watching over them with smiles on their faces. Marcus paused for a moment, leaning against a lamppost as he observed the scene. It was strange how happiness could feel so close yet remain completely out of reach. He wondered what it would be like to belong to one of those families, to have someone care about where you went or whether you were safe. Shaking his head, he pushed the thought away. Dwelling on such things only made the ache inside him worse. Feeling restless, Marcus decided to move on. There was a small bridge not far from the park where he often sought refuge during colder days. Beneath its arches, the wind was less biting, and he could sometimes gather enough scraps of wood to build a tiny fire. As he walked, his mind drifted to the future again. What would happen to him once winter set in fully? The shelters were already overcrowded, and finding space wouldn't be easy. He knew he needed to come up with a plan, though he wasn't sure what that plan should be. When he finally reached the bridge, Marcus settled down in his usual spot, arranging the pieces of wood he'd collected earlier into a makeshift pile. Striking a match, he coaxed the flames to life, holding his hands close to absorb whatever warmth they offered. For a while, he simply stared at the flickering fire, letting its glow chase away some of the shadows in his mind. Then, without warning, a scream pierced the air, a sharp, desperate cry that sent chills running down his spine. Startled, Marcus jumped to his feet, his eyes scanning the direction of the noise. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and though every instinct told him to stay hidden, to avoid getting involved, something deeper within him stirred. Against all odds, Marcus started running toward the source of the scream, unaware that this single decision would alter the course of his life forever. The scream echoed through the cold November air, sharp and urgent, slicing through the peaceful hum of Millennium Park. Marcus's heart pounded as he sprinted toward the sound, his worn sneakers slipping slightly on the icy pavement. The noise had come from near the frozen pond, a shallow body of water that had been drained for the winter, but still held a thin layer of ice over its surface. As Marcus approached, he saw a growing crowd gathered at the edge of the pond, their faces pale with shock and fear. Some pointed frantically toward the middle of the ice while others shouted warnings or clutched their phones to call for help. Pushing his way through the throng of people, Marcus finally saw what everyone was staring at. A little girl, no older than 5, was struggling in the freezing water. She must have wandered too close to the edge of the pond and fallen through the brittle ice. Her small arms flailed desperately as she tried to keep her head above the surface, but the icy grip of the water seemed determined to pull her under. Her cries were muffled now, more like gasps for air than screams, and her tiny body trembled violently from the cold. For a moment, Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The scene before him was terrifying, so much so that even the adults around him hesitated to act. He could see the fear etched on their faces. They wanted to help, but the danger was obvious. The ice was too thin, too fragile. Anyone who stepped onto it risked falling through themselves. Instead of rushing forward, most of them stood rooted to the spot, some yelling into their phones for emergency services, others filming the chaos with trembling hands. But Marcus couldn't just stand there. Something inside him, a mix of instinct, compassion, and perhaps a lifetime of feeling invisible, wouldn't let him turn away. He thought about the times he'd felt helpless on the streets, the nights when hunger gnawed at his stomach and loneliness weighed heavy on his chest. He knew what it meant to feel abandoned, to think no one cared enough to help, and here was this little girl, fighting for her life, depending on someone to step up. Without giving himself time to second guess, Marcus kicked off his sneakers and began rolling up the legs of his jeans. The biting wind stung his bare feet, but he didn't stop. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. People turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden authority in his tone. For a moment, they simply stared, unsure whether to trust this scruffy teenager who looked like he belonged on the fringes of society, rather than in the center of a rescue attempt. But Marcus didn't wait for permission. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the ice. The surface groaned beneath his weight, sending shivers down his spine. Every step felt like a gamble, each crackle threatening to send him plunging into the icy depths below. His heart raced as he moved forward, crawling, on all fours to distribute his weight evenly. The closer he got to the girl, the louder the cracks became. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, urging him to retreat, but he forced himself to focus. He locked eyes with the child, whose wide, tear-filled gaze met his own. In that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about showing her she wasn't alone. Reaching the edge of the broken ice, Marcus stretched out his arm, his fingers brushing against hers. "Grab my hand," he shouted, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The girl reached up weakly, her movements sluggish from the cold. With every ounce of strength he had, Marcus pulled her toward him, wrapping his arms around her tiny frame. She clung to him tightly, sobbing uncontrollably as he lifted her out of the water. Her clothes were soaked and heavy, making the task even harder, but Marcus refused to give up. Now came the hardest part, getting both of them back to safety. The ice beneath him was cracking faster now, splintering with every movement. Marcus shifted his weight carefully, inching backward toward the solid ground. Each step felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into his bones as he fought to keep moving. Behind him, the crowd cheered nervously, urging him on. Finally, after what felt like hours, Marcus reached the edge of the pond. Hands reached out to grab the girl, pulling her free from his grasp and wrapping her in coats and blankets. Exhausted, Marcus collapsed onto the snowy ground beside her, his body shaking violently from the cold. As paramedics rushed to the scene, tending to the girl first, Marcus sat silently, trying to catch his breath. His clothes were drenched, clinging to his skin and leaving him shivering uncontrollably. Yet despite the physical toll, a strange sense of calm washed over him. He had done something real, something meaningful. For once in his life, he hadn't been invisible. The crowd was still buzzing around him, some whispering words of gratitude, others marveling at his bravery. But Marcus barely noticed. His attention was drawn to a man standing a few feet away, a tall figure in a tailored suit, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. That man, Marcus would later learn, was Daniel Harper, a wealthy philanthropist whose daughter had nearly lost her life that day. But at that moment, all Marcus knew was that he had saved someone who mattered deeply to someone else. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he mattered too. The paramedics worked quickly, their movements practiced and efficient. They wrapped the little girl in thermal blankets, speaking softly to calm her as they checked her vitals. Her shivers were violent, but she was alive. Alive because of Marcus. He sat a few feet away, still trembling from the cold, his soaked clothes clinging to his skin like a second layer of ice. His hands were numb, his teeth chattered uncontrollably, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Despite the physical toll his body had endured, Marcus couldn't take his eyes off the child. She was so small, so fragile, yet her spirit seemed unbroken. Even through her tears, there was a flicker of resilience in her wide, frightened eyes as the paramedics tended to her. A man stepped forward, Daniel Harper. He knelt beside his daughter, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." The relief on his face was unmistakable, but it wasn't just concern for his daughter that consumed him. His gaze kept drifting back to Marcus, who sat hunched over, trying to warm himself by rubbing his arms. There was something about this young man, a homeless teenager in tattered clothes, that struck Daniel deeply. It wasn't just the act of bravery itself. It was the fact that Marcus had risked everything without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. Once the paramedics assured Daniel that his daughter was stable enough to be moved, he turned his full attention to Marcus. Walking over, he crouched down beside him, studying the boy's exhausted expression. "You saved her life," Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with gratitude. Marcus looked up, startled by the intensity in the man's tone. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like this before, with respect, admiration, even awe. People usually avoided eye contact with him or dismissed him altogether, treating him as if he were invisible. But here was this stranger looking at him as though he mattered, as though what he'd done truly mattered. I just did what anyone would have done," Marcus stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His words trailed off, unsure of how to articulate what he was feeling. In truth, he hadn't thought twice about jumping onto the ice. Saving the girl had felt like the only choice, the only thing worth doing in that moment. But hearing Daniel's gratitude made him realize that not everyone would have acted the way he did. Most people would have hesitated, letting fear dictate their actions. Yet Marcus hadn't hesitated, not for a single second. Daniel shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "No," he said firmly. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You put your own life on the line to save hers. That takes courage. Real courage." The sincerity in his voice caught Marcus off guard. He wasn't used to being praised, especially not by someone like Daniel. The man exuded success and authority. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and confident demeanor were a stark contrast to Marcus's ragged appearance. And yet, there was no judgment in Daniel's gaze, only genuine appreciation. By now, the crowd that had gathered around the pond had begun to disperse. Some lingered nearby, whispering among themselves about the dramatic rescue, while others simply walked away, their curiosity satisfied. A few reporters had arrived, drawn by the commotion, and were attempting to get statements from witnesses, but Marcus paid them no mind. All he could focus on was the warmth slowly returning to his limbs and the strange sensation of being seen. For the first time in years, he felt visible. When the paramedics finished examining Marcus, they urged him to go to the hospital for further treatment. Hypothermia was a serious concern, and they wanted to ensure he hadn't suffered any lasting damage. But Marcus hesitated. Hospitals meant paperwork, questions and explanations he wasn't ready to give. Besides, he had no money, no insurance, and no idea how he would explain his situation to the staff. Sensing his reluctance, Daniel intervened. "Come with us," he said gently. "We'll make sure you're taken care of." Marcus glanced at him warily. He had learned to be cautious when it came to trusting strangers. Life on the streets had taught him that kindness often came with strings attached and promises rarely lasted. But there was something different about Daniel, something sincere. Against his better judgment, Marcus nodded. "Okay," he said, quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. At the hospital, Marcus was treated for mild hypothermia. Nurses wrapped him in warm blankets and gave him dry clothes to wear, a pair of scrubs that smelled faintly of detergent. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed by his side, asking questions about his life and listening intently to every word Marcus said. At first, Marcus was hesitant to share too much. Talking about his past always left him feeling raw and exposed, as though he were opening old wounds. But Daniel's patience and empathy eventually broke through his defenses. By the time they left the hospital hours later, Marcus had told him about growing up without parents, surviving on scraps, and dreaming of a better future, despite the odds stacked against him. Over the next few weeks, Daniel made it his mission to help Marcus turn those dreams into reality. He visited him regularly, bringing food, clean clothes, and books to read. More importantly, he really listened, to what Marcus wanted out of life. When Marcus expressed interest in finishing high school, Daniel helped him enroll in an alternative education program designed for students who had fallen behind. He also arranged for Marcus to stay temporarily at a youth shelter run by a local nonprofit organization, ensuring he had a safe place to sleep at night. But Daniel didn't stop there. Recognizing Marcus's potential, he introduced him to mentors who could guide him academically and personally. One of these mentors was a retired teacher named Mrs. Thompson, who volunteered her time to tutor struggling students. She took an immediate liking to Marcus, impressed by his determination and intelligence. Under her guidance, Marcus began to catch up on the years of schooling he had missed. Slowly but surely, he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could build a future for himself. Throughout this entire process, Daniel remained a constant presence in Marcus's life. He wasn't just offering financial support. He was investing in Marcus as a person. Their relationship evolved from one of gratitude to genuine friendship. Daniel saw in Marcus qualities that many people overlooked: resilience, compassion, and an unshakable will to survive. And Marcus, in turn, found in Daniel a role model and advocate, someone who believed in him when no one else did. One evening, as they sat together in Daniel's spacious living room, Marcus finally found the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Why are you doing all this for me?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. "I mean, you don't owe me anything. I was just doing what anyone should have done." Daniel smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Because you reminded me of something important," he replied. "You reminded me that heroism isn't about wealth or status. It's about character, about choosing to do the right thing, even when it's hard, and that's a lesson I think we can all learn from you." Marcus lowered his gaze, unsure of how to respond. For so long, he had seen himself as insignificant, as someone whose choices didn't matter. But now, thanks to Daniel's unwavering belief in him, he was beginning to see himself differently. He was more than just a homeless teenager. He was a survivor, a hero. And perhaps someday, he would become something even greater. Months passed, and Marcus's life began to transform in ways he could never have imagined. What started as a chance encounter at the frozen pond had blossomed into something far greater, a second chance at life. With Daniel Harper's unwavering support, Marcus found himself stepping into a world he had only dreamed of before. It wasn't easy, though. Every day brought new challenges, from adjusting to structured schoolwork after years of irregular learning to navigating the complexities of relationships with peers who came from vastly different backgrounds. But Marcus approached each hurdle with determination, driven by the belief that he was finally on the path to building a better future. Daniel didn't just provide financial assistance. He became a mentor, a guide, and even a friend. He introduced Marcus to people who inspired him, teachers, community leaders, and professionals who shared their stories of overcoming adversity. These interactions opened Marcus's eyes to possibilities he hadn't considered before. For instance, one evening, while attending a charity event hosted by Daniel, Marcus met Dr. Lisa Martinez, a pediatrician who had grown up in foster care. Her journey resonated deeply with Marcus. Listening to her talk about how she turned her struggles into motivation to help others sparked an idea within him. Maybe he could use his own experiences to make a difference someday. Encouraged by this newfound inspiration, Marcus threw himself into his studies. Mrs. Thompson, his tutor, marveled at his progress. "You're a natural learner," she told him one afternoon after a particularly productive session. "When you set your mind to something, you don't give up until you've mastered it." Her words meant a lot to Marcus because they reminded him of his own strength. For so long, he had doubted his abilities, believing that his circumstances defined him. Now he realized that his resilience and hard work were what truly mattered. As the months went by, Marcus also began to explore interests outside of academics. Daniel encouraged him to try new things, to step out of his comfort zone and discover what made him passionate. One Saturday morning, Daniel took Marcus to a local community center where volunteers were teaching kids how to play basketball. At first, Marcus hesitated. He hadn't played sports since he was a child, and he worried he wouldn't fit in. But once he picked up the ball and started shooting hoops, something clicked. The rhythm of dribbling, the focus required to aim for the basket. It all felt freeing, almost meditative. Before long, Marcus joined a recreational league, finding joy not only in the game but also in the camaraderie it fostered. Through basketball, Marcus formed friendships that further enriched his life. His teammates came from diverse backgrounds, some privileged and others facing hardships similar to his own. They bonded over their shared love for the sport, but they also supported one another off the court. When Marcus struggled with balancing practice and schoolwork, his teammates rallied around him, offering advice and encouragement. In turn, Marcus became a source of inspiration for them. His story of survival and perseverance motivated them to push through their own obstacles, whether it was excelling in exams or dealing with personal issues. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to advocate for Marcus in ways that extended beyond education and extracurricular activities. He helped Marcus secure a part-time job at a nearby bookstore, giving him a sense of responsibility and independence. Working behind the counter, organizing shelves, and assisting customers gave Marcus a taste of normalcy, a glimpse into the kind of stable life he had always craved. The bookstore owner, Mrs. Patel, quickly grew fond of Marcus, praising his work ethic and kindness toward patrons. She often slipped him extra hours during busy seasons, knowing how much he valued earning his own money. But perhaps the most significant change in Marcus's life came when he decided to pursue a career in social work. Inspired by his conversations with Dr. Martinez and countless late-night discussions with Daniel, Marcus realized that he wanted to dedicate his life to helping others who faced challenges like his own. He envisioned himself working with homeless youth, guiding them toward resources and opportunities that could change their lives. This dream gave him purpose, fueling his ambition to excel academically and emotionally. As Marcus worked tirelessly toward his goals, the media eventually caught wind of his story. A local journalist wrote a feature article about the homeless teenager who had saved a child's life and gone on to rebuild his own. The piece highlighted Marcus's bravery, resilience, and the transformative impact of Daniel's mentorship. Overnight, Marcus became a symbol of hope for many. People reached out to him via social media, sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph. Some thanked him for inspiring them to keep going despite their hardships, while others offered words of encouragement as he continued his journey. The attention was overwhelming at first. Marcus wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the sudden influx of messages and interviews left him feeling exposed. But Daniel reassured him, reminding him that his story had the power to inspire change. Together, they carefully navigated the media frenzy, ensuring that Marcus retained control over how his narrative was shared. Rather than shying away from the attention, Marcus embraced it as an opportunity to raise awareness about homelessness and the importance of mentorship. He spoke candidly about his experiences, hoping to shed light on the systemic issues that kept so many young people trapped in cycles of poverty. One of the highlights of this period came when Marcus was invited to speak at a charity gala hosted by Daniel's Foundation. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of well-dressed attendees, Marcus felt a mix of nerves and pride. Looking out at the audience, he spotted familiar faces. The little girl whose life he had saved, now a thriving preteen. Mrs. Thompson beaming with pride, and Daniel seated front and center nodding encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to speak. "I never thought my story would matter to anyone," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "For most of my life I felt invisible, like no one cared whether I succeeded or failed. But then I learned something important, that we all have the power to make a difference no matter where we come from or what we've been through. Saving that little girl taught me that even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life, including your own." His speech earned a standing ovation, the room erupting in applause as tears glistened in the eyes of many attendees. That night marked a turning point for Marcus. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a leader, a role model, and a beacon of hope for countless others. And yet, despite the accolades and recognition, Marcus remained grounded. He knew that success wasn't about fame or wealth. It was about staying true to himself and continuing to fight for a better tomorrow. With each passing day, Marcus grew more confident in his ability to shape his destiny. He still faced challenges, of course, but he tackled them with the same courage and determination that had carried him through the darkest moments of his life. Thanks to Daniel's guidance and his own relentless spirit, Marcus was no longer defined by the streets he had once called home. Instead, he was forging a new identity, one built on resilience, compassion, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of change. Years passed, and Marcus Johnson was no longer the same teenager who had once wandered the streets of Chicago, searching for scraps to survive. The journey from homelessness to hope had been long and grueling, but every step had been worth it. What began with a single act of bravery on a freezing November afternoon had blossomed into a life filled with purpose, achievement, and meaning. Now in his mid-20s, Marcus stood tall, literally and figuratively, as someone who had defied the odds stacked against him. His transformation wasn't just personal. It rippled outward, touching countless lives along the way. After graduating high school, Marcus earned a scholarship to attend college, a dream he had once thought impossible. With Daniel Harper's continued support and guidance, he majored in social work, determined to dedicate his life to helping others facing struggles similar to his own. College wasn't easy. Juggling classes, part-time jobs, and internships tested his resolve time and again. There were moments when self-doubt crept in, whispering that he didn't belong in such an academic environment. But Marcus silenced those doubts by reminding himself why he was there, not just for himself, but for all the kids still out there sleeping under bridges or scavenging for food. Every late-night study session, every challenging exam, and every difficult conversation with professors became fuel for his mission. During his senior year, Marcus interned at a nonprofit organization focused on supporting homeless youth. It was here that he truly found his calling. He worked directly with teenagers who reminded him so much of his younger self, kids who felt invisible, abandoned, and hopeless. Marcus understood their pain because he had lived it. He didn't just offer them advice or resources. He shared his story openly, showing them that change was possible. "If I can do it," he would tell them, "so can you." His authenticity resonated deeply, earning him not only their trust but also their admiration. Many of these young people went on to turn their lives around, inspired by Marcus's example. Upon graduating, Marcus landed a full-time position at the same nonprofit, eventually rising to become its program director. Under his leadership, the organization expanded its reach, providing shelter, education, job training, and mentorship programs to hundreds of at-risk youth across the city. Marcus implemented innovative initiatives based on his own experiences, ensuring that the services offered were practical and impactful. One of his proudest achievements was creating a peer mentoring program where former clients who had overcome homelessness returned to guide those currently struggling. This initiative fostered a sense of community and belonging among participants, proving that healing often came not just from external help, but also from within. As Marcus's professional life flourished, so did his personal one. Though he remained close to Daniel Harper, who had become like a father figure to him, Marcus also built a family of his own. He met Sarah, a fellow advocate for underserved communities, during a conference on youth empowerment. Their shared passion for making a difference drew them together, and they married a few years later. Together, they adopted 2 children, a brother and sister who had been in foster care, and created a loving home filled with laughter, warmth, and endless encouragement. For Marcus, this was the ultimate fulfillment of his childhood dreams. The cozy apartment he had once imagined as a boy had transformed into a real house, brimming with love and stability. Despite his success, Marcus never forgot where he came from. He made it a point to visit the neighborhoods and shelters where he had once sought refuge, speaking to groups of young people about resilience and hope. On one such occasion, he returned to the very bridge beneath which he had huddled for warmth on that fateful winter day. Standing there, surrounded by a group of teenagers eager to hear his story, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had come full circle, and he knew he owed much of his success to the kindness of strangers. Strangers like Daniel Harper, Mrs. Thompson, and even the little girl whose life he had saved. That little girl, now a teenager herself, remained a cherished part of Marcus's life. Over the years, she and her father Daniel had stayed in touch, celebrating milestones and holidays together as an extended family. Her presence served as a constant reminder of how interconnected lives could be, how one person's actions could ripple outward in ways they might never anticipate. At 18, she graduated high school with honors and gave a heartfelt speech thanking Marcus for saving her life, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. "You showed me what true courage looks like," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And because of you, I believe I can be brave too." Marcus's story continued to inspire others far beyond his immediate circle. After the media coverage of his rescue and subsequent achievements, he became a sought-after speaker at conferences, schools, and community events. He traveled across the country, sharing his message of resilience and redemption. His talks weren't just about overcoming adversity. They were about recognizing the inherent value in every individual, regardless of their circumstances. "We're all more than our worst moments," he would say, "more than our mistakes, our failures, or the labels society tries to put on us. We have the power to rewrite our stories if we choose to." One of the most poignant moments of Marcus's career came when he was invited to speak at a national summit on homelessness. Standing on stage before thousands of policymakers, activists, and advocates, Marcus recounted his journey, from the icy pond where he saved a child to the boardroom where he now shaped policies affecting thousands of lives. His words carried weight not because of eloquence alone, but because of authenticity. When he concluded his speech with a simple yet powerful statement, "No one should have to fight alone," the audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. Though Marcus had achieved remarkable success, he remained humble and grounded. He often reflected on the lessons he had learned throughout his journey, that kindness, no matter how small, could spark monumental change, that having someone believe in you could make all the difference, and that resilience wasn't about never falling, it was about getting back up each time you did. These principles guided him in both his personal and professional life, shaping the kind of leader and human being he wanted to be. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, Marcus liked to sit by the window of his home, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Sometimes he thought about the boy he used to be, the scared, hungry teenager wandering aimlessly through snow-covered streets. Other times, He allowed himself to marvel at how far he had come. The scars of his past hadn't disappeared. They were etched into his memory forever, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of his strength, his perseverance, and his capacity to change. Marcus's story wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever doubted themselves, everyone who had ever felt invisible, and everyone who dared to hope for a better tomorrow. Through his journey, he proved that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. And sometimes, all it took was one courageous act, one leap onto thin ice, to rewrite the course of a life forever.